Hey guys, no, we're not on the stairs this morning. Just like we're not on the stairs this morning.
Testing. 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 Test. This was loud. 560. Does not sound as loud.
And then Joni, check in with your teacher.
Testing. Can you guys turn up microphone 560? That's possible.
Testing, testing.
Microphone at 560.
Mine's working. Okay.
Have to eat it as much? Is this when you really have to get right up on it?
Hello, hello. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah.
Test it out, make sure it's good.
This is not forgotten. People that have been through some pretty tragic stuff in the history of our society are sharing their crap that they've been through. So Holocaust, Japanese internment camp, so that history doesn't forget it. Kind of get the vibe. Pretty serious content.
I didn't learn much about the Holocaust because when we were, it was online class.
Yes.
Awesome.
They even
Then I'm
have.
gonna turn my phone off.
Yep. And then you can just be like the kids doing it all in the back.
Okay, thank you. I use a script.
Point. Because you, John, you gonna start?
Yes. Yeah. I believe that's. I'm 99% sure we'll double check that real quick.
It's just like,
Yeah, it is a glare. I wonder if they can.
I don't know why they have them on. It's
Do
really.
you know how to chair up a little? I got it. I got it. It's kind of.
Where? Uh-huh. Because both of us can't talk.
I know. So you be going for think oh I'm not gonna do it. I'm not gonna do it. I'll just have them do it.
Well, you
I'll
can
just
do
say,
it if you're, they'll start it.
Yeah.
Then they start your press.
Please.
Oh,
I think I better. Yeah.
oh my gosh.
Yeah. If they can
I,
walk out.
we've been asking and they just haven't done it.
Oh, it's really hard. I can't.
Guy at all right now.
Which is he the young man?
He was in a kind of a green.
Yeah. Yeah, that is really hard. It's right on our file.
I'll have you a coffee.
You said you
years ago,
Oh,
before they
years-
were in school.
Oh, okay.
The other year.
Remember, George, that
John, we are just blinded.
Still.
Yeah, it hasn't changed.
Hey, Ian, those lights are blinding the guest speakers.
that's what I want to do. Is
I wanted to, but I'm not sure they want. To ask John if it's okay to get a picture.
All right, Ravens, those of you like up, we have some extra seats. You please feel free to fill in down here.
I am.
High schoolers, if you're upstairs and you'd like to fill. Ravens in 3. Ravens in 2. Ravens in 1. Quiet, please. Please fill in. We have empty seats down here. So if you're up on the balcony, Malachi, guys, I don't want you standing. Please come sit, grab a seat. This is a long event. Please fill in.
Turn the dang thing off. I don't know the thing.
He's working on it right now.
Would you mind asking if it's okay if we take a picture of this group? I wanted to take a picture.
Oh, go right ahead.
No, people might be upset. No?
I'll do the same thing.
Okay. Now I'm going to turn it off. Turn it off.
Are you good with your phone? How do you keep your notes in your phone?
I can. I
Oh,
haven't.
Okay. Oh.
But I do
I just-
have my slideshow on my
Yeah.
phone.
Okay. I've never done that. I've done it at I use Google.
Yeah. I have Google Drive.
I have
Apparently-
Google Drive, and
so-
I could do just
Yeah, grab a seat.
up on my phone. Yeah, I never even thought of that.
When we're done. No, when we're done. All right, please filter in. Thank you, Ravens. And if you need to, go right ahead. Like, yep, we. The cameras, like the kids can move. I believe so. All right, Ravens in 3. Ravens in 2. Ravens in 1. Thank you. No, I don't like doing the clapping. Good morning. Thank you all for coming this Friday morning. We've been very blessed with some amazing weather this week. Finally, the sun is out. That's what that orb is in the sky. And it's been getting warmer as well. It is my distinct honor to welcome you all to our 4th biannual Voices Not Forgotten event. This is an event that Mr. Lehman and I came up with about 8 years ago when we went into Portland and saw a panel discussion put together by the the Japanese American Museum of Oregon and the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education in Portland. And about 15 minutes into that event, we looked at each other and said, how can we do this for our students at iTech? Because these stories are too important to not be told and not be heard. The events today that you're going to hear about are not pleasant. If you need a moment to gather yourselves, please do so, but please try to do so quietly and respectfully. Please make sure cell phones are off. Please do not take pictures or video. This is being recorded, though, for view later on. Our wonderful Mr. Hurst's iTech crew is filming this for all of us and streaming this as well. So, as I begin today, I'm Mr. Zingali, Mr. Z, and we're here today to hear about two of the most atrocious events in our world's history. Before we move on, let's see, can I get the next slide there, Ian? There we go. I do want to thank the Japanese American Museum of Oregon and the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, along with our iTech PTSA. They helped fundraise for this and allowed us to bring these two amazing guests here to us today. So let's give those organizations a quick round of applause. Next slide, if you could, Ian, or crew. All right. Before we begin, I want to pay some respects. This is our 4th year doing this, obviously every other year. If you were in attendance at iTech 2 years ago via Zoom, or 4 years ago when we were at Skyview, you got to hear from Mr. George Nakata. George was quite a fiery individual. Many of you may remember how he spoke. He really enjoyed his time coming to iTech and speaking with all of you young people so much. But unfortunately, with a lot of people his age and that survived the Japanese American incarceration and the Holocaust, they're getting older. And last year we lost Mr. Nakata. And so I just want to make sure that we mention him and keep him in our thoughts. He would love to be here with us all today. He was really looking forward to eventually being in this building and doing this with all of us like this, but he is no longer with us, unfortunately. And then the next one. There we go. Is Mr. Les Agner. Les and his wife Ava were some of the first people that I met about 11 years ago when I was still a student teacher. They came to the school I was at and spoke so passionately. Their story, if you don't know it, I won't go into too much detail. It's truly, it's remarkable. They both survived the Holocaust at different times and then met later on and got married. But they are some of the people responsible for the memorial in Washington Park in Oregon. And they were very integral in making that happen. And so unfortunately, we also lost Les this last year. So please also, I just want to acknowledge him for everything he's done for Holocaust education over these last almost 40 years. Because without people like Les and George, things like this do not grow and continue to happen. So today, I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming in Ms. Joni Kimoto and Deb Moroka. They're here to speak to you on behalf of Joni, on behalf of herself, and Deb on behalf of her mother. With any further ado, I give you Ms. Joni Kimoto.
What? No.
There we go. Now it's on.
Thank you all. What a welcoming group of students we have here. I would like to say something about George Nakata. I knew George as a young girl. He was older than me, but we knew each other well. And through the years, I knew about him and what he did for our community, sharing his story. And a few years ago, I became involved in the speakers panel with the Japanese American Museum. And George came up to me one day and he said, "Joni, thank you for doing this." He said, "Keep doing it." He said, "Our stories should never die. They need to be kept alive." And that's what I'm doing here today. This is an untold story that needs to be told. It's an American story of my family's experience of incarceration, the aftermath of returning home, our resilience, and our redress. Could I have the first slide, please? Thank you. Thank you. My presentation is entitled "Looking Like the Enemy," and it's a Japanese-American experience. I am a descendant of Japanese immigrants, and I am a third-generation Japanese-American, and I'm called a sansei. And I had been imprisoned with my family by the United States government for a crime that we didn't commit. We thought that we were Americans, born and raised here, but our crime was that we looked like the enemy who America was at war with in 1941. Next, please. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's executive order was the order which shaped the lives of all Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. We had been stripped of our constitutional rights without being informed of our charges, without trial or legal counsel, and we were forcibly removed from our homes. It was a wrongful imprisonment, and we were placed in desolate American prisons with guard towers, searchlights, barbed wire surrounding our camp, and we even have armed militia with rifles with orders to shoot us if they thought we would escape. The government called this act protective custody. Next, please. But it's important for me to tell my story from my family's early beginnings, who we were before our lives had been shattered. My story begins when my grandparents and my great-grandparents immigrated from Japan in the early 1900s to improve their lives. America was the land of opportunity, and Japan was going through political changes and famine and drought. And the Northwest was still growing with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and that impacted the recruitment of Japanese immigrants to work on the railroads, the forest, and the farms. Both my great-grandfather and my grandfather came to Oregon and worked in the lumber camps, and they cut trees and they made railroad ties, and this was grueling, hard work for them. Next, please. A few years later, my great-grandmother and her daughters joined them, and they all settled in Portland. This was a processing center for immigrants, and they were the first generation called Issei's. They had donned Western attire, and they assimilated into a new culture, and they obeyed new laws and were learning to become Americans. And here they are in that photo to the right, and they're sitting in an aeroplane. And in that photo, you'll see a picture of Mount Hood in the background. But you can see that they were starting to look very American. Please. My grandparents established their roots in Portland's Nihonmachi. It was known as Japantown, and And this was a community of 10 city blocks, and it covered over, there were probably 200 families living there and maybe 100 businesses that flourished for the Japanese immigrants. Nihonmachi was a hub of activity and a vibrant community, and there were stores and hotels and restaurants and churches and schools and social clubs. And by 1940, the population had grown to over 4,000 residents. But in 1942, Japantown had died. Today, this district is known as Portland's Old Town. In this slide, you'll see from 1910 to 1936, my family had operated a hotel, a restaurant, a bathhouse, a laundry, and they were called the Mikado. Mikado means emperor. And they all worked hard, and they prospered, and they provided housing and services to the many Japanese immigrants coming in. Next, please. Now, their American-born children were called Niseis. They were second generation. And my mother, Kyo, a Nisei, was born in 1918 by a midwife at the Mikado Hotel. And it was in this district where she lived and played and worked for over 20 years. My mother is shown on the left bottom row. And they were all raised in that Japanese tradition, but they were still living in an American culture. And my parents, my Nisei uncles and aunts, and my mother all attended American school, and then they would go to Japanese school after, and they could speak both languages very well. Next, please. Thank you. Despite my grandparents' adjustment to a new world and becoming successful, there were many laws that were created to prohibit Japanese assimilation and economic success in the United States. In 1924, U.S. Congress had banned all immigration from Asia. In other words, there was a racial quota. And that law would remain until 1965. In 1922, the Supreme Court had ruled that the first-generation Japanese were ineligible for citizenship and they couldn't apply for naturalization. One had to belong to the Caucasian race and be white, so the color of your skin became legal qualifications for citizenship. But of course, there was less discrimination towards the European immigrants. My grandparents were denied being American citizens, despite the fact that they lived here for many, many years, and they remained as aliens. And they waited for 45 years before they could even apply for naturalization. In 1923, unless you were an American citizen, you couldn't own or lease land. In our city of Portland, the Realty Board had prohibited members selling property to anyone in white neighborhood if you were African American or Asian. This was called redlining, and this kept us segregated from living in parts of Portland, so my family had remained in Nihonmachi. Clearly, the Japanese did not belong in America. We were considered crafty, untrustworthy. They thought of us as having disease, and they thought of us as being the yellow menace. This happened to be the racial climate before World War II, where there was discrimination and racism. Next, please. In 1937, my mother, a Nisei, marries another Nisei, my father, Katz Nakayama, from Seattle, Washington. And since my parents were both Americans by birth, they were the future hope for my grandparents. And so my parents could obtain a bank loan and they could buy property. So together, my parents and my grandparents and my teenage uncle had left the familiarity of Nihonmachi and ventured out to start a new life. Next, please. And so the American dream finally became a reality, and they bravely assimilated into an all-white neighborhood, the suburban neighborhood in Southeast Portland. They all became grocers, and they were buying their first home with a white picket fence, and we had an animal. We had animals, a dog and a cat. I was born, and life was good for my young parents. But a year after the photo on the right was taken in 1940, a year after, Pearl Harbor was bombed. Next, please. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, was a spark which ignited a long history of systemic exclusion and anti-Japanese sentiments. This contributed to the government's decision to imprison 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. 2/3 of us were Americans, and 1/3 were Iseis, like my grandparents. Next, please. Within hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Oregon Issei community leaders, religious clergy, and teachers and professionals were arrested against their will. And without due process of law, they were sent to Department of Justice camps. The Issei elders were imprisoned as potential threats to national security. And there was great fear in our community and mass hysteria in our general U.S. population. Next, please. And then we had suspicion, lots of suspicious hate groups that accelerated. And they said, we can't trust those people. And there were malicious lies that had been circulated by our government, and they even crafted propaganda films. We had been characterized as having buck teeth and slant eyes and glasses. And there was a distinct failure to differentiate between the Japanese Americans and the Japanese enemy. Even our very beloved Dr. Seuss was a racist, and he drew cartoons of us. One of his cartoons shows us as being in collision with the enemy and part of the fifth column. Newspaper articles were printed that said that Japanese farmers were poisoning people. Untruthful news said that Japanese living on the West Coast we all had powerful radios that transmitted messages to Japan, and we were all a threat to national security. There's a man by the name of Lieutenant General John DeWitt, and he was a racist, and he would become the administrator of the internment program. He had declared that American loyalty was based on ethnicity and blood, and he had been quoted as saying, "A Jap is a Jap. I don't care if they are American citizens. We need to gather them up and get rid of them. We must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map. They are the enemy race." He was also quoted as saying that our racial characteristics had made us unfit as American citizenship. Next, thank you. My father is seen circled in red. Back, please. Let's see. Okay, there, thanks. My father is seen circled in red in these photos. In the left, he is shown as a member of the Japanese American Grocers Association, and what they did was they raised funds for the war effort. And here they are seen donating to the Portland Sunshine Dairy. In the right photo, he's with other Japanese American businessmen, and he's pledging support and loyalty to the United States, and they were sending a telegram to President Roosevelt. And what they were doing was pleading for the release of those Issei leaders who had been arrested and imprisoned in Department of Justice camps. But it was all to deaf ears, and within a month, my family too were visited by the FBI at our home. A constitutional violation happened when the FBI came to our home without search warrants, and they came to unreasonably search and seize anything they thought would be contraband. My grandfather, the reason they came is because my grandfather was a devout member of the Shinto faith. That happened to be the same faith as the Emperor of Japan. And so they thought he would be loyal to the emperor because he practiced the same faith. And they told my grandfather, "You have no rights. You're an enemy. You're not a U.S. citizen." Remember I told you about they were denied citizenship? But he was considered an enemy alien. And so the FBI agents had confiscated his prayer book because it was written in Japanese. And my mother and my American uncle were both also of the same faith, and they practiced that faith. But they couldn't do it anymore because their priest had been taken to one of the Department of Justice camps. So that was a violation of their religious freedom. The FBI searched and seized anything that they considered could be used against the United States government, and they took away my father's binoculars and a camera because they thought he could use them for spying for the enemy. And they were looking for guns. And they asked each member of our household if there were any guns in a house, even me, and I was 3.5 years old. And I said, "Yeah, we have a gun." And my mother and father were looking at me and saying, "What?" And I said to the FBI agents, "It's upstairs." So we went upstairs to the attic. They opened the trunk, and inside was indeed a gun. But it was a toy pistol. It was a cap gun, and it belonged to my young uncle. There was, of course, big sighs of relief from my mom and dad, and the FBI agents were very embarrassed about asking a little 3.5-year-old about a gun. Anyway, they didn't arrest my grandfather for his religious beliefs, and they didn't arrest him because he had books that had been written in Japan. Next, please. The military had imposed rules almost daily that told us what we could and couldn't do. We had a curfew, and we couldn't leave our homes from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. We had travel bans, and we lived under martial law. Our fate was sealed with Lieutenant General John DeWitt. He had set up military zones on the West Coast. Executive order was now enacted. No congressman had objected. It took 1 hour in the Senate and a half hour in the House. Politicians and business owners were happy to see this happen. So now the 3-tiered process of exclusion, removal, and incarceration became law. Next, please. History has suggested that President Roosevelt caved in to DeWitt and other politicians when he signed Executive Order 9066. This act was clearly racially motivated for political and economic reasons. Next, please. The end of April 1942, the people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast military zones encompassed Oregon, California, Washington, and parts of Alaska. And we were ordered to leave our homes, our businesses, our employment, and our schools. we had only 7 to 10 days for forced evacuation. We lost the home my grandparents and parents were buying. Our business was sold for pennies on the dollar. We lost our car and our grocery truck. We gave away our family pets. Our bank accounts were frozen. My parents and grandparents had Japanese furniture and dishes and treasures in their home, but they felt that they had to destroy them because having anything Japanese might incriminate them to Japan. We were lucky, but we were very lucky because we had Caucasian friends who stored these family treasures for us during the duration of the war. But my family living in Nihonmachi were not lucky. There was no Caucasian neighbors to help them, and they burned and destroyed anything they had that was connected to Japan. And so, with only what we could carry, we were forced into isolation and exile, and we left behind a life that we could no longer have again. The Oregon Journal, there's a newspaper article there on the left that posted its headlines, "Portland to be the first Jap-free city." Next, please. And so, with only what we could carry, we were herded into the former International Livestock Exhibition Center on May 5th, 1942. I have thought it must have been so hard for my parents to decide what to take for their unknown destination and their future. Please note that sign there that says Portland Assembly Center. That's what the military renamed where we were to go. Just a month earlier, that building exhibited livestock, and this place was converted from animal stalls to human stalls. If you look at the right of that photo, you'll see faintly some barbed wire, and that was now a reminder for us of our existence with barbed wire and military guards. Next, please. My identity as Joni Nakayama was now a number, and I was tagged as citizen 15259C. Even though I was little, my mother had me remember that number, just like a little girl would remember her birthday, because she was so worried that I would get lost in that sea of 4,000 people who lived with me in that center. We lived under deplorable conditions, with a smell of animal waste that was with us daily, and where fly paper would hang above our hay-stuffed mattresses in an 8x10 stall. We suffered from heat, lack of privacy, institutional food, and unsanitary conditions. But this had prepared us for what might lay ahead. Next, please. In September of '42, we traveled by train with blinds drawn, not knowing our destination, to our second prison. And there were guards that were stationed in each of the rail cars. And the government said to us that we would be going to a relocation center. Like the name Assembly Center, this was another euphemism. And we would be held in protective custody, the military said, away from any kind of racial retribution. And we would be traveling to one of the 10 inland concentration camps where hundreds of thousands of people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast would be imprisoned. Next, please. Our protective custody was in a desolate desert located in a place called Minidoka, Idaho. And this was federally owned land that was the sacred home belonging to the Shoshone-Bannock Native American tribe. At the time that this photo was taken, you'll see that there was no barbed wire around surrounding the camp. But shortly after, the military put up barbed wire. And the reason they did that is they wanted to show the public that we would be free to move around. But the military guards did put barbed wire after the photo was taken. And soon we had guard towers and soldiers with guns that were pointed inward. I was 4 when we arrived in Minidoka, but it's a day that I still remember because it's the first time I had seen my mother cry, and she looked out at this desolate place that we were to be, and there was an awful dust storm that was coming on, and it was so hard that we could barely see our hands before our eyes. And my mother took a handkerchief from her purse, and she covered my face. And I remember her words clearly saying to me, "Joni, this is where we will live. This is our new home." And we lived in this desolate desert with barbed wire fences and sagebrush that was rolling around. Minidoka had been was on 33,000 acres of land, and there were 36 residential blocks. There would be 13,000 of us that would be living there. We lived on Block 32, Barrack 7, Apartment D, and the quarters we lived in were more designed for the military than they were for families. We lived in a 10 by 20 room with 1 light bulb, 3 army cots, 2 blankets each, and a coal-burning stove. And the walls were thinly partitioned, and they didn't go to the ceiling, so family conversations and sounds were carried throughout the barracks. We had no cooking facilities or indoor plumbing. And to eat, to use the latrine, to bathe and wash our clothes, we had to leave our quarters. Each block had housed a dining, mess hall, latrines, and lavatories for communal use. The camp was not ready for us. Some blocks didn't even have toilets ready, and the residents had to use trenches. And for the first few months, our showers were cold for the lack of hot water. And in the latrine area, there were no walls, and in the showers, there was nothing to separate us. And we stood in line. You can see that picture. We stood in line for our daily needs. We learned patience, but we lost our privacy, our dignity, and our modesty. Next, please. The temperatures in Minidoka were extreme, and they were unkind to Pacific Northwesterners. That first winter, the temperatures had dropped to minus 20 degrees, and the spring had brought rain, and it brought lots of flooding. And I remember wooden planks that were used as our sidewalks, and I remember falling all the time into the desert mud because it was so slippery and wet on those planks. Our summers were so hot, they went up to over 100 degrees. And because of the uninsulated barracks that we lived in, dust was always filtering in our rooms. My mother would be sweeping the floor all the time, it seems. And then she would they gave us newspapers, and she would strip the newspapers, and she would wet them, and then she would stuff them into the cracks of the walls and on the floors just to prevent dust filtering through. But dust was everywhere. I remember that clearly. It was in our food, it was in our hair, and it was in our clothes. This was truly a strained setting of camp life, and all of the traditional family things that we did as a family had disintegrated. And as in any prison at the beginning, I think productivity was a big challenge. The inmates were psychologically damaged with anger, denial, and grieving, over the loss of their lives. We often asked, what have we done wrong? Why are our rights taken away? But my Issei grandparents would say to us, "Shigata ganai." That means it can't be helped. Gaman, be patient, and with silence and dignity. Gambate, be strong, endure, persevere. And these were words that I heard growing up. Next, please. This is where I lived this is my barrack. And you can barely see my father. He's sitting in the front. I think it's circled. Maybe the red is faded out a little bit. But I'm sitting on my father's lap in the front row, and my mother is sitting on a bench with my new baby brother who was born in Minidoka. My dad was resourceful, and he studied in the camp's library, and he became an electrician. And pretty soon he became a chief electrician. And guess what he was paid? $16 a month. $16 a month. He was also our block leader, and he was our representative. But the inmates had endured, and they resolved to make Minidoka run smoothly. We had lots of farmers who came from the Northwest, and they worked that desert soil, and they produced fresh vegetables for us. And then they built a cold storage unit, and they would store the vegetables so we can enjoy vegetables all year round. They built 14 baseball, softball diamonds in and around the blocks. That favorite American pastime of baseball became normalized our lives. The newspapers, we had a newspaper that was printed, and pretty soon the community barracks were transformed into places of worship for different faith services. We had organized music groups and dances and socials and classes and clubs, and that became so important for its residences. There was also material that was out in the desert that the inmates would go out and pick up and create beautiful works of art. You know, we all came from different communities, from Oregon, Washington, and parts of Alaska. But what we did was create a new community that provided a level of normalcy, achievement, creativity, and most of all, hope. Next, please. When you're a child of 4 or 5, you pretty much accept where you live and not what you're deprived of. And my parents had provided us with a normal life of love and protection. And I was a happy little girl, and I adjusted to the confines of living behind the barbed wire. And I never experienced my parents' hardships during those years. I'll tell you a little story. I was a talkative chatterbox in camp, and my mother would allow me to visit my grandparents and my uncles and aunts and family friends living on other blocks, and so I would venture out every day and visit them. And when I would come back in the evening later the day, I could never eat dinner because I was so full of all the treats that were given to me. So my father, being a very clever man, had taken a little cardboard and he painted it red, white, and blue. And on that cardboard, it read, "Please do not feed me." This is, of course, a facsimile of that, but it pretty much tells this is what I was to wear around the camp every day. Next, please. During our incarceration, the government had forced the Niseis to respond to issues of loyalty and an oath questionnaire. And our loyalty had been made very evident when 33,000 Japanese Americans had volunteered to serve in segregated military units to fight for our country. This was the 442nd All-Nisei Regimental Combat Team, comprised of Nisei volunteers from Hawaii and the mainland, part of the U.S. Army's 100th Infantry Battalion. These men fought valiantly in Europe, and 60% of them had lost their lives or suffered casualties. The 442 had become the most highly decorated unit of its size in the history of American warfare, and they were awarded 18,000 awards, including 9,500 Purple Hearts and 5,200 Bronze Stars. These men were loyal and they were brave, and many of their families were still held behind barbed wires. In the Pacific arena, approximately 5,000 Nisei soldiers served in the U.S. military intelligence because they were able to use their Japanese language skills to interrogate the captured prisoners and translate battle plans. This act had shortened the war effort in the Pacific by 2 years. In the summer, next please. In the summer of 1944, my parents were allowed to resettle in the Midwest, Chicago. Because there was a labor shortage, many of the men were serving already in the military, and so they needed people to work. And so the WRA, the War Relocation Authority, who governed our lives, had released our family with conditions of leaving Minidoka. My father had to have a sponsor, and he had to declare his loyalty before leaving. And my father was sponsored by a very kind Jewish man. And Dad would be a washing machine repairman, which he knew nothing about. And we would be living in Mr. Stein's basement apartment on the south side of Chicago. When we left Minidoka, we were all fingerprinted. And we had parole cards, just like you see here. And those parole cards could be revoked at any time. Even my baby brother had his picture taken and his fingerprint taken. Next, please. As a condition of our release, my family had to attend topics, classes on how to make friends in the outside world and how you should behave. We had rules to follow. We couldn't gather with other Japanese. We couldn't speak in their language. We had to assimilate, is what they said. And we were not allowed, of course. They said you cannot visit any bars or taverns. Anyway, these rules had applied to all citizens who left camp, even when the war ended. And when my grandparents and relatives left, they had to take this class to learn how to assimilate, and then they were given $25, a meal ticket, and a rail pass to return to unwelcoming communities, lost homes, and lost dreams. Next, please. Coming back, we were not welcome in some neighborhoods and towns. Many people had faced hostility, discriminatory housing practices, and employment. We left camp, and we were now in the real outside world. The government encouraged us to blend, but it wasn't all that easy. Next, please. This is what I remember, probably more than anything. In Chicago, I was now with kids who didn't look like me, and I had met kids who were white and brown and black, but I now faced name-calling. I was bullied, and I was tormented with the realities of prejudice and fear and my identity. Kids at that time felt, I think, empowered to call me names and victimize me. And I remember having rocks thrown at me and even being bitten. And they said to me that I was a dirty Jap and that people like me caused the war. These kids were like 8 or 9 years old. They were older than me, but they were already learning how to hate. In Minidoka, I had never heard the word Jap, and I didn't even know what Pearl Harbor was or who it was. I had been an innocent child of truly unfortunate circumstances. And I still remember wanting to go back to Minidoka because that's where I felt safe. That's where I felt safe because I was with kids that looked like me, and nobody said those words to me. And I was afraid and I was ashamed to be Japanese, and I had denied my heritage and my culture. I grew up thinking American. To be an American, you had to be a white person. Next, please. Like my parents, I assimilated and I was silent. And one day while I was in college, during the beginning of the civil rights movement, and I was encouraged by my college professor, I had the opportunity to learn about incarceration. I interviewed and asked my parents, who very seldom spoke of the pain of incarceration and post-war treatment. They always said to me growing up, "Yes, Joni, we were in camp," and that was the end of the story. And I needed to find out who I was and why we were imprisoned. And so I went to the public library based on my recommendation from my college professor, and I went to the library and I went through these things called microfiches. None of you probably know what that is because you all use Google and you can get instant answers. But I spent weeks and weeks there. And I went through newspapers and periodicals and lots of propaganda because no books had been written in the 50s about this. I discovered myself. I discovered myself as a Japanese American, and I was no longer ashamed. I became entrenched in my heritage, and I involved myself into the Japanese community. I thought at that time, no one should decide who should be an American. No American should be subjected to racism and racist policies and rejection and displacement. The Bill of Rights had been written to protect its citizens against government abuses of power, and yet this had happened to us. And then there were civil rights activists who paved the way for us. I think we went back. There you go. Thank you. There was Gordon Hirabayashi and Min Yasui and Fred Korematsu, and these men resisted and challenged the government policies by testing the Constitution. They were all imprisoned. They fought for justice all the way to the Supreme Court, but justice didn't serve them. One of my heroes is Minoru Yasui from Hood River, Oregon. He's the man in the center. He was a young attorney who questioned the constitutional rights by purposely violating the curfew, and he went to jail to be arrested and spent 9 months in solitary confinement. He was in Portland's Multnomah County Jail, and then he was released and incarcerated to Minidoka. Gordon Hirabayashi and Fred Korematsu also were in prison challenging our constitution of government orders. These men were all awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for their years of advocating for our civil rights. Min Yasui is the only Oregonian to receive this highest civilian award. And to the right, you'll see Yuri Kochiyama, who was a Nisei female activists who advocated for many causes: black separatism, anti-war movements, and the Japanese reparation. Next, please. It took 40 years after the war and another generation to receive a formal apology from our government. My parents and my grandparents' generation were silent. They had embraced that traditional value that encourages them to put the past behind them. They felt betrayed, ashamed, and they never wanted to speak of their treatment. But our generation, the Sanseis, saw what happened, and that was a form of racial oppression that needed to be spoken out against. Because of our government's demands, a commission had been formed, and with the work of Yasui and Korematsu and Hirabayashi, our government finally admitted that they were wrong by stating that there were no acts of sabotage or of espionage, and we had been imprisoned due to racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failed political leadership. Our incarceration was racially motivated and not of military necessity. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was now signed into law. Of the 120,000 incarcerated, only a little over 80,000 were alive to receive this apology, with a redress and a reparation of $20,000 during President Reagan and President Bush's administration. By then, my beloved grandparents had died, and they were the brave people who came to America, who believed that this was the land of freedom, democracy, and opportunity, and they left Japan only to be unwelcomed, alienated, denied citizenship, and then imprisoned. And I weep for them. I weep for them and my parents and their struggles, and I also honor them for having the gaman and the gambate spirit. Next, please. It took me almost a lifetime before I could speak to an audience like you. Our stories are over 80 years old, and change is slow, and anti-Asian attacks have been on the rise again. But I continue to use my voice as a survivor. I am an American storyteller. Silence does not lead to change. History teaches the future and the fate of our nation. History has to be brought back into public consciousness. Our nation is wonderful, and it still has much to learn. Never again has been my mantra. America cannot repeat this type of history. Next, please. In 2019, I went to a Minidoka pilgrimage with 13 members of my family a few years ago, and it was a bittersweet time for all of us. And here's a photo you'll see of my little brother and me in camp, and then here we are, much older, 75 years later, visiting this historical site. Next, please. On the doorway of the Minidoka Visitors Bureau are words that resonate with me, and this is how I will end my talk. And it says, "This is not just a Japanese-American story, but it's an American story with implications for the world." Thank you.
It's hard to do.
Oh, honey, it's okay. I get teary-eyed every time I speak, it's
Yeah,
hard.
brings back memories.
Yeah, it does.
Thank you so much, Joni, for sharing your story with us today. I know that that is not easy, and your courage we are all grateful for it. These are the stories that we must keep in our hearts and in our minds as we move forward in life. No one here in our country should suffer through those atrocities. And that's why we have events like this. Our next speaker, Deb Maroka, will now speak on behalf of her mother, who survived the Holocaust in Europe.
Do people need a break, a 5 minutes bathroom or something?
That might be a good idea. If you are okay with that, we can do that.
I'm okay with that.
Let's do, I'm going to give you 3 minutes. Stand up, stretch, try to go to the bathroom,
Try to go.
and we'll come back.
I'm going to hand this mic to you. You want me to?
I'm going to flip it on the, or you can,
You want me to move over?
I can move, or I
Whatever. Okay.
So I was aware through that I was a Jew, but mainly also because
How to use. When I don't talk, I speak a little differently, but it's not too group-like. Okay, sorry.
Well, we will see.
That mic was a little far away from me. Yeah, that's better.
That's probably better. Face.
All right, there we go. Okay. All right, in 3, in 2, Ravens in 1. All right. Thank you all. So it is my distinct honor, thank you so much, Joni, for sharing, to now introduce Deb Maroka, who will speak on behalf of her late mother, Elaine. Elaine
Hoekstra.
Hoska.
Hoekstra.
Thank you so
Close
much.
enough.
All right. Thank you. And Deb, thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Tony. I mean, you did an awesome job. I'm so impressed. I learned a lot myself. So I family of my father's. It warms my heart to be still able to do that because she did it starting in the 1990s, and her and I did it together for about 14 years. Because she stroke her tongue, so I did it. So, okay, we'll try that. If you can't hear me, let me know. So anyway, I started talking with Mom after she had had her stroke, and she could do part of the time, and the tongue would get too tired, and then I'd pick up the pieces. Anyway, my mom's now gone 5 years. She died on Holocaust Remembrance Day, January 27th, in 2018. I have 4 brothers and sisters. I was born in the Netherlands. We immigrated to the United States in 1958. And I, of course, did not know any English. Basically, we had learned some, but not enough to actually speak. So I do have an accent, as my parents both knew English, but hadn't spoken a lot. They both carried an accent. Okay, this is about my mom, who was born in 1923. When the war broke out, all at once. Doing it wrong. She was born in 23, so the war broke out in the Netherlands May 10th of 1940. Of course, the war had been going since 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. The Dutch people, the government in the Netherlands, had not been in a war for over 200 years. They had been a neutral country during the First World War and had had no wars at all. They had no idea, really, that Germany wanted to take over Holland. You can go to the next one. Try it. Okay. So they weren't prepared at all. They didn't start mobilizing the militaries at all until sometime in 1940 or 1939, but they were antiquated. They didn't have the right uniforms, they didn't have the artillery, they didn't have the planes that they should have had to fight an army like the German army. So when they invaded May 10th of 1940, they were basically totally unprepared. And if you're unprepared for a war, what are you going to do? And what happened is this, I talk a little bit about why the war happened in the first place. Because after World War I, and Germany was in a bad financial position, they had to start paying reparations to other countries after World War I, so there was a depression. And when there is a depression in a country and there's unrest, if somebody comes along that says, if it's these people's fault and you're the one that's hurting, you have a tendency to fall into that category and start to believe that propaganda. And we've seen this in this country, where all at once somebody comes along and says, it's those people's fault, and it's those people's fault, and we get rid of those people, then all's going to be well. And that's kind of what happened in Germany. And in that process, people were brainwashed, basically, into believing that indeed it was the Jews and the Romas and the homosexuals and all of these minorities that he had it in for, Hitler had it in for. And when you're in a difficult situation, like I say, there's a lot of people that will just start to believe that. And it's easy. The Jews have always been somebody that's been persecuted, so it's easy. And why the Jews? Everybody always asks, why them, you know? One of the reasons that I think it happened is because in Christian religions, both Catholic and Christian, they could not lend money at interest. Well, guess what? The Jews have lots of religious rules, but there's not one that says they can lend money at interest. So what did they become? Anybody? I'm sorry? Yes, back there. Well, because what happened is they started banks. And banks made money. So actually they did quite well. And there was this jealousy that they were doing well in the financial world. And if you're in a situation like Germany was during World War I, before the war, they were having a hard time. Money was useless. You had a wheelbarrow of money to get something, a loaf of bread. It was ridiculous. So anyway, and the Romas, which are the gypsies, they had it in for them because they're different, and they're different skin color, again. And they perceived Jews as being a little darker hair and dark-skinned and dark eyes, and your eyebrows were different, your nose was hook nose. So they tried to find ways to identify these minorities that they had it in for. So that's, I think, how he got all these people on board to believe that if we just get rid of those people and we become an Aryan race, then all's going to be better. So once you start to believe that and you work that for a number of years, which he did, and then you start rounding them up. Holland was not aware how bad it was in Germany already. They had already been dealing with the Jewish population and negating them from having they couldn't hold the jobs that they used to have in government. They couldn't have their jobs. They had, 1939, there was the Kristallnacht, and they took all the Jewish shops and they burned all the books. So we knew about that, or my family knew about that, but they had no idea it was going to get as bad as it did. Prior to 1940, the Anne Frank family and many other families had already left Germany looking for a place to go. But these were people that had money. And in the beginning, they could still move and other countries would take them in. Over time, it became more difficult because other countries didn't want the refugees either. So a lot of the poorer people did not have a place to go. Holland did accept refugees. They built a camp called Westerbork for the Jewish refugees that didn't have a place and didn't have a job. And that they built like some houses. They built about 200 little houses for these refugees. So let's try the next one. Okay, this is about Nelson Mandela, and I think it's really good to read. No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate and they can be taught to love, which is an easier thing to do, it's easier to learn to love than it is to hate. For love comes more naturally to human mankind. So it's so much easier, and like I say, it was so easy at that time when things are difficult to teach people to hate. But that's kind of what we're trying to get to, is why are we talking about something like this that's happened 80 years ago? It's to change and to make sure that things like that don't happen again. Okay, next. This is my mom, and she wrote a book called Wishing Upon a Star, and she didn't do that until after she retired. And she worked till she was 72. My parents divorced in like 1972, which was very, very difficult for my mom during that time. And then she went back to school. Originally, she was going to become a doctor when she graduated from high school. That, of course, was cut short because she actually graduated in 1940 from high school and started college, but that didn't work out. And then all of us kids came along eventually. And so she didn't go back to school until she was in her 50s, became a licensed surveyor at 65, got her water rights certification at 67, and then worked till she was 72. So, she modeled that kind of stuff for us children. Okay, let's try the next one. I'm sorry, that first picture that you saw that was my father, my mother, and my oldest brother. My oldest brother was born April 28th of 1942. He's 81 years old today. Okay, we'll try. This is my mom's mother and her sister and two brothers. If you can try it. You can hear my mom's voice with this little clip on the microphone. Does anybody know how to do that? If not, it doesn't matter. It's not the end of the world. It's just interesting to hear her voice. You can try the top one. We'll try it. If it doesn't work, it's fine.
And I was born the 4th of January, 1926.
Okay, yeah, it's not a problem. Because I probably don't have enough time anyway. So my grandmother is behind my mom. My mom was the youngest. Her next sibling was like 6 years older, and then 8 years older. So she was the baby of the family, and she always thinks that everybody said she was spoiled, but she didn't care. It was fine. But anyway, back to the time of 1940. My mom was 17. My father was 18. They were in high school. They had no idea what was going to happen. But as soon as the Germans took over, which was only 4 days of war, because they burned the city. Next picture. We'll try the next one. That's okay. All right. Holland, as you can see, is a very tiny country. It's only about 1/6 the size of Oregon. And the population compared to Oregon then was like 19 million, or 9 million in Holland, and 60 people per square mile, and 10 people per in Oregon. But actually that number 60 should have been 500 and some, $534 should have been per square mile. So the population density was huge compared to Oregon. And if you can imagine how it would be here, it's totally different. So, being as it was so little, but why did the Germans really want it? 2 reasons. One, they thought they could actually take Holland in 1 day. And the reason they wanted to take over Holland in 1 day was they could use the airports in Holland to jump off and start bombing England. That was the reason to begin with. And then the other reason is that the Dutch people, non-Jewish people, and other minorities, are very Aryan like the Germans. So he thought that if he could take over Holland and have more Aryan people, that would help his purpose. Next. Well, they bombed the city, Rotterdam, which was in one day, one night, and bombed it pretty much flat. And the city that my mother lived in was Utrecht, which isn't that horribly far away, 40, 50 miles. And could still see stuff coming down in Utrecht. Started threatening to bomb all other big I am doing not right with the mic. Okay, well that's good.
I might switch it on in a second.
Okay, we'll try it. Okay, so we had, they bombed the city of Rotterdam. They then threatened to bomb all the other big cities. We had really nothing to fight with. So what do? We have a royalty system in the Netherlands, still do. And we gave up by the 14th because they threatened to bomb the other cities. You have nothing to fight with. Why would you risk having your cities bombed and your people killed? So the next day, and Holland is so small, the Nazis, or the German army, came into Holland, and they came all the way to the city that my mom was living in. They had beautiful brand new tanks. The soldiers had beautiful black uniforms, black shiny boots, and they looked like they were a band almost. People came out to watch them march in, and my parents, my grandparents, and aunts and uncles who all went out like everybody else because they rolled in. They thought, what are we doing? We're standing here admiring our enemy? Are we nuts? Again, we're having it goes in and out. So the first thing the Nazis did over Holland, they take over the radio stations, they take over and the newspapers and the theaters. Had theaters, and in those days, they would run newsreels about what was going on in the world. So by taking over all the radio stations and all the newspapers and any other magazines, they could promote their propaganda. And the first thing they said is, people, don't worry about anything. Nothing's going to change. Well, we might have to ration food because now we have this army here that needs food. So to be able to do that, we have to have everybody register at their courthouse in their city. So what are you going to do? You still want to eat and sleep indoors, so you go register, right? Let's try the next slide. If you can try the next slide. Okay. So here's an ID card, and on that ID card, it has my mother's picture. On one side, it has, I actually have this with me, and fingerprints and an address and religion and all of those things. But when she first got this ID card, the J was not on it. That came later. So everybody had an ID card, and and it has numbers on it, so then they could say, okay, on this day, you get rations, and on another day with the ending number this, you get the rations. So it was useful for that purpose. So people all did it. But the J came later. Let's try the next one. Okay. So you had an ID card, and you had a ration. You used it for your ration. So you got textile ration cards, and you got foods, both of those. And then the law started coming. They said, oh, nothing's much going to change. But have any of you been to Holland or the Netherlands? Okay. Do you know how flat it is? Right. So everybody has a bicycle because you don't need a 10-speed. Any speed will work. And everybody has at least one, and sometimes two, because if you ride your bike from work to the train or the bus station, then you have one at the other end, wherever you are, depending on if you're going to school or wherever it is you have. But many people had more than one bike. And the transportation system was very good in Holland, besides bikes and buses and trams and trains. So one of the first things they did to isolate the Jews, and my mom always said we were never scared enough. We were not scared enough, no matter what time during that whole 5-year period. So the first thing they had to start doing, the Jews had to turn in their bicycles. And the Nazis were extremely smart and psychologically incredibly. And people had no knowledge of what they were trying to do. So what you did, you had to turn in your bike. But if you didn't turn in your bike and you had ID, and the idea was that indeed you were this particular nationality, or what they said you were because of the way you looked. So you had to turn in your bike. So this is a receipt that my grandfather got for turning in his bicycle. It's in German, and my grandfather was very smart, was a professor, and very well known in Europe as well as Holland, and spoke 5 languages, so he was pretty smart. He turned in his bicycle, and the receipt says, it has tires, but the bell's missing. So who the hell cares if the bell's missing? But what the receipt represents is that you think, or you might think, that you could get that bicycle back. It was stolen, you were never going to get it back. But again, you were lulled in psychologically to think that you might get it back. My grandfather always thought the whole thing was going to be temporary. They're not going to, it's going to be over in no time. So it started with the bicycles, and they started taking all the different rights away. My grandparents actually owned a home, which was unusual in those days, but they were upper middle class, I guess. And so because they owned a house and he had a decent job, they had household help. Now they, in those days, had household help because they had no washers and dryers, so it was still hand wash. They didn't have refrigerators, so people shopped on a daily basis or every other day. They didn't do their laundry every other day or once a week. That has to be done, and they hang their sheets out during the day to air. So people had a way different lifestyle. But before long, of course, all the household help that my grandparents had, they were not Jewish. Now, my grandparents were Jewish due to the way the Nazis identified Jews. The way they did that was they said if you had 4 Jewish grandparents, you were full Jewish. If you had 3 Jewish grandparents, you were full Jewish. If you had 2, you were half Jewish. Now, how did they know if you had 4 Jewish grandparents or if you had 3 or 2? The way they did that is that because, like churches, many people got married in a synagogue, and like churches, they keep records. So theoretically, they could go and find out if you had Jewish grandparents. So again, it was a fear tactic, because you knew, usually, if you had 4 Jewish grandparents that were Jewish, or if they'd been married in the synagogue. So it was self-identification. But if you looked at all like they thought you were going to look like, hook nose, dark eyes, dark hair, darker skin, olive skin, they would pick you up. And if you had any knowledge, if they asked you and you said no, they said you look like it, you were gone. It didn't matter. So anyway, out of the fear of being identified, you did it yourself. My mom, according to that, is full Jewish because her great-grandparents, or her grandparents, the 4 of them were all married in the synagogue. And on my father's side, it was just my grandmother that was half Jewish, or Jewish, and he, in turn, was half Jewish. So the difference between the way they were treated was huge. My father's experiences during the war as a half-Jew was way different than my mother. My mother only heard the language, the German language, in a very nasty way at all times. My father, on the other hand, even though he was also in camps, he heard it very differently, which was interesting for both of them to afterwards have these different ideas about how people were treated. Okay, so there was many laws. There was like 142 laws that came into place. So they couldn't ride their bike anymore, and then pretty soon they couldn't go to any public places, no public places at all. Then they couldn't have their non-Jewish people work for them anymore. Then they couldn't, before long, couldn't go to non-Jewish homes. They could not have people come to visit them that were non-Jewish. Then the quotas of the time frame came between this time in the morning and this time at night. You could only be on the street. Then comes the fact that Jews could only shop with their cards after a certain time. And then came the fact that Jews could no longer go to any schools unless it was a Jewish school. In Holland, there was only about 140-some thousand Jews that they have accounted for, but there might have been more or less. So there were very few Jewish schools. Most Jews in Holland were assimilated. They owned property, they were in government, they were in every aspect of life. There was a concentration of Jews in Amsterdam. That was a diamond hub and business, and so there was a lot of people in that industry. So that's where most of the Jews of that in total were. Okay, let's try the next one. Okay, my great-grandparents on my mom's side were still alive. My great-grandparents on my grandfather's side had already perished, not due to the Germans, but had died of old age. My great-grandparents lived in The Hague. My grandfather had been retired. He'd been in the diamond industry, but as he retired, he started painted the billboards for movies. And before long, all at once came the notice that elder Jews would have to all go to Amsterdam. Well, my grandfather was hoping that with his clout he could save my great-grandparents. So he talked to some officers and he got the right to have my great-grandparents move to Utrecht. And again, something interesting to me happened, is all they could bring was a suitcase and their four-poster bed. Now, what does an adult pack when they're going to go somewhere? They don't really know how long, but if that's all you can pack, what would you pack? Anybody? Nobody wants to say anything? Money, all right. Valuables, that is what the Nazis were looking for. And what a way to get it. Because eventually, of course, they did that to all Jews. And none of the Jews were knowing where they were going to go. So they got to pack the suitcase and they got to bring their four-poster bed. Side note, I have an uncle that wrote the play about the four-poster bed, which eventually was on Broadway. But that's an aside note. We still have the four-poster bed in the family, by the way. Okay, so they got to move in with my grandparents. Next slide. Okay, so that was in 1940, 41. My parents had both started college in September of 1940. Mom went to a pre-med school. My father was going to tropical forestry engineering. And before long, again, a rule came. My mother, being full Jewish, could no longer go to college unless she went to a Jewish school. Well, there wasn't any Jewish college in Holland. There weren't enough of them. My father, being half Jewish, could no longer go to his college, but he could go to a community college. So my father did that. He moved to Amsterdam and went to a community college there. My mom could no longer go to school. Prior to the occupation of Holland, my grandparents had taken in two little Jewish girls that had come on a train from Germany with a bag of their clothes and a stuffed animal. And what happened is those little children that came on the trains from East Germany would go to orphanages, and the orphanages would be full, and they would ask people to take the kids. Well, these two little girls were kosher little girls. They spoke German, they spoke Hebrew, and they didn't fit well in my grandparents' home. I mean, they wanted them to take care of them, but there was no little kids there. The only ones left in the household at the time of the war were my grandparents, my mother, and her one brother. One brother was already in the United States going to college, and she had a sister that was already older and out of school and was in hiding already. And she wasn't in hiding to begin with, but she was on her own, living not in the house. So there was only actually 4 people. So, and there was no kids. But they took care of these little kids, and it was really hard. They were there for about 3 or 4 months. Oh my gosh, I only have 10 minutes left. Holy moly. Okay, so to go through this quickly, my mother became pregnant in 1941. Not a very smart thing to do when you're in a war situation. But my mom and my father did want my brother. And my great-grandparents were living there, and my mom did have my brother April 28th of 1942. Now, she could, okay, we'll go to the next one. We're going to go through this fast. Okay, next one. So, the star she had to wear starting May 1st of 1942. And as you can see, it came on a yellow square, and then my grandmother, it was very thin material, so she put backings on them, and then eventually you had to sew it on something. In the beginning, you could pin it on, and then it had to be sewed on. So my grandmother made little vests for everybody in the family. It looks like Hebrew. It's not Hebrew. It's just a font. And the word J-O-O-D is the Dutch word for Jew. The Nazis were very nice. In every country that they made people wear the yellow star, they made it language country. So in Germany, it was J-U-D-E. In French, it was a French word. So everybody had to wear it. If you were 6 years of old or older, you had to wear this Jewish star. So Mom walked to the hospital, couldn't rent a taxi because you're Jewish. In 1941, they already had to go back to get the J stamped on their ID card, if you decided to do that. Most people decided to do it because of the fact that you would have relatives with the same name. You would fear that if somebody caught you and you didn't have the J and you had the same name and somebody else had, that you would be in trouble, which you would be. So she had the J stamped. And then when she walked to the hospital in 1942 to have my brother, which was, before May 1st, she didn't have to wear the star, but coming out of the hospital, she did have to wear the star. Now, my mother was not married due to the fact that if a Jew married a non-Jew, the non-Jew becomes a Jew. And they already knew that they were being treated very differently. So my father's last name is Hoekstra, which is a very Dutch name. Luckily, my brother was blonde and blue-eyed, which was very fortunate for him. And they had a notary public come to the hospital to have my brother have my father's last name, which was very smart to do. So when she took him home, he was under the Hoekstra name, and she had to wear the star. My great-grandparents got to meet their first grandchild. And when they lived there, they eventually had to leave. Since I have only 10, 15 minutes, I can't do it all. They eventually had to go to Amsterdam. And they indeed were there for a little while, a few weeks. Then they were all going to the Jewish theater. And from there, up on a cattle car. And they went to Auschwitz and were murdered there almost the day they were there or the next day. The reason we know that is because my great-grandfather, wrote on a little card or piece of paper and put it through the slit of the boxcar. Please send XYZ address. And on that he wrote, "Don't worry about Grandma and I don't know where we're going, but I'll be fine. We will be fine. I can peel potatoes very fast, and the Nazis like potatoes peeled. They do." And my grandmother could darn socks, which meant in those days, soldiers will have holes in their socks, and Grandma will have something to do. Of course, that didn't happen, but due to that note that they did get, somebody was nice enough to send it to them. I don't have that, sadly enough. We know the day basically that they left, and we know the day that the death books in Yad Vashem say that they were gassed, because the Nazis kept excellent records. So we know that it took 3 or so days to get there, and then they were there, and they have the date that they were actually gassed. So that was the story about my great-grandparents. Now, there's so many stories, but I just have to keep going. Okay, we'll try the next one. Okay, so after my great-grandparents had gone and the situation in Holland was getting worse, my mother was worried about my brother. She had organized that in the evening, she would take him in his baby buggy down the street, and one of the ladies that used to be their household help would keep him for the night, and then they'd reverse that in the morning. By the time he was about 3 months old, she decided things were getting so bad, we needed to find a place for hiding for him. Luckily, my grandfather had lots of clout, lots of nice people that he knew, and there was a family that offered to take him. My mother one day packed his little suitcase, and took him in his baby buggy down to the park where this other lady would meet him, and from there he ended up with his family that pretended to be his parents, or his mom, war mom. She wasn't married. She did as though she had adopted him from, because he was an orphan, from Rotterdam, the city that was bombed, so it made a good excuse, and she luckily had him registered in the courthouse, which was later for another benefit. Anyway, he had a great upbringing for the 3.5 years that he was there. He didn't know anybody else growing up. He had a family, he had grandparents, he had aunts and uncles, he had some cousins, so he was perfectly fine. My mom did not know where he was, did not want to know where he was, and people always ask why not. And the reason was, she says, if somebody might know about my brother or my son, and if they're torturing me, pulling out my fingernails or doing whatever, I don't know what I will say. And I don't want to know, because then I can't say.
Sorry, we only have 5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes. It's just not enough. Okay, so eventually my grandparents, my mom and dad and her parents ended up in a camp called the Schaffelaar, because my grandfather was able to get my mother and his wife on this list of the intellectuals. The Nazis loved lists. They had lists for the baptized Jews, the different lists, diamond list and the intellectual. The intellectual list ended up in this camp called Schaffelaar. It was all for intellectuals. They were there for 3+ months. Very interesting story about that. I don't have time. So from there, they ended up in Camp Westerbork, and that's the next slide, I think, if you can do that. So they went to, my father didn't. My father ended up in different camps, but my mom ended up in Westerbork, which is another slide down, since I don't have enough time to talk. And that's Camp Westerbork, which is where originally the Dutch had built this for the German Jewish refugees. Then they built, over time, they put in 200 barracks with 300 people each. And then in 1943, the train started going every Tuesday, and then sometimes Thursdays, as well as there was down times, and then there was up times of that. My mom at one time had to work on the platform. Everybody had to work. Conditions were awful. Food was awful. They didn't actually have mattresses. They had bags with straw. She had to help on the platform when the train was loading the 80 people to a boxcar, a barrel for water, a barrel for going to the bathroom. Not enough places for people to sit down even. It was horrible. But what she witnessed is that the barracks were separated, men and women on one side, women and children on one side up to age 14, men with the boys to 14 and up were on the other side. Sanitary conditions were horrible. Mom had never had a bath for almost 3 years. She never had decent hygiene, no feminine hygiene, none of that. So all these people looked horrible, even though they had big posters that said, keep clean, but you couldn't. There was no inside toilet except one. the outhouses were for 10 people. And normally people didn't get to visit that much. Men could not take care of their families like they're used to. So the days that this train left, they put the notice out the night before that you had to pack the suitcase, and they put the family together. It felt less threatening if you as a family get to go on the train than if just women go or just all the men and the boys. So there was all different ways that they manipulated things so that it felt better, even though it was awful. So here was the situation. Mom, I think you can do the next slide. She witnessed the fact that there's so much to say. This is the camp mail. They were in Barrack 85. So this is one postcard of my father sending a postcard. The witness is, this is the mom carrying a little child on her arm. She has two little girls behind her. She has her carrying a satchel on the one side and the little one on the other side. Two little girls behind her, and her husband with a bag or a suitcase behind them. And the woman is having next slide. She's having a hard time getting up into the boxcar because they have a high instep. And so she was kind of wobbling, trying to get into the boxcar, and the Nazi that's standing there says, he takes schnell, schnell, and rams his gun butt up her butt. And the husband, who has not been able to do much for his wife and his children, just blurted out, "Don't you do that to my wife." So what happens next? And I get all sorts of answers. Since I don't have time, I'll just tell you. They shoot one of the little girls. Just like all of you, do you think anybody on that platform says a word? Nobody cries, nobody says anything. They just get on the train. So smart and so mean and evil. Okay, so then those are the kind of things that were happening. Since I have no time, I'm going to tell you they were liberated April 12th of 1945. They couldn't leave the camp. The Canadians liberated the camp, and they had to stay until they make sure that people had a place to go, because the whole country had been starving since early 1944. It was a hunger winter, so everybody was in horrible shape. People didn't have a place to go back to. Plus, all at once, there was the NSB supporters, the Nazi supporters that came into the camp that the Canadians wanted vetted to make sure that they were as actual refugees. So my grandfather and my grandmother and my mom and, oh, I didn't even tell you about my uncle that escaped between routes. He escaped from the next camp by getting out of the train car, because that was a passenger car. He went under the train, spent the night, hung onto the train until it left, and then he spent the night and eventually was in hiding. That's another story, till the end of the war. So when they finally were able to leave, my father did find my mother too. He had escaped from another camp and then had other issues, but he eventually found where my mom, what camp she was in, because she'd mimeographed a list of the survivors in her camp, which was only 20 per group that they had there, because they had groups of the gypsies and they had the homosexuals and they had different groups. So there was only 20 in her group that was still left. And eventually they got out and were able to go home, which the house was pretty much destroyed. That's another story. Because it had been taken by the Nazis at one point for their officers. Then when they left, then the Canadians took it over. So they ended up just in the same apartment that my uncle was hiding. My parents then went to get my brother. The lady who was his war mom was an awesome lady, but she had no idea that my parents would survive, so she anticipated that she would have my brother for the rest of her life. As it turned out, that was not the case. She was so heartbroken that instead of letting my parents stay there for a little while to get to know my brother, she said, just take him. And he didn't want to go, of course. She said, I'll come get you, which of course she didn't. My brother was heartbroken. My mother also. She was thrilled, but because of 3 years plus, She could not talk about him. She could not let people know. She had her own struggles of just survival. That emotionally up here, she knew in her head that she loved this little boy, but she didn't have the emotional attachment anymore. And of course, he had no attachment, plus anger probably because he was not with the mom he had. Took years and years before my mom and him actually had a really good relationship. Before she died, she told him she loved him, which was, I saw him melt. And I think had the detachment for all the things that you should, fetus, all of those kind of things. Emotional attachment wasn't there. And I didn't know that as a child. I didn't know it growing up until later in life you start to realize those things. All of us kids have had struggles in our life. We've all had cancer. We've all been survivors so far. We look at life as, thank God, and every day is a new day. We never poor me thing. I mean, everybody has a poor me day, but none of us stay in that mode. And the difference when I talk about Mom being a survivor, she was a victim, but a survivor, what makes the difference? What makes the difference between a victim and a survivor? It's attitude. It's attitude. We see people that stay in that poor me thing, that victim mode, and they are never going to be happy. But if you become the survivor, the person who did whatever it is did to you, they're not, you're the winner. If you stay in the victim mode, they're the winner. So I always say to kids, please, please be a survivor. We're all going to have traumas in our life, but be the survivor. Don't stay in the victim mode. Be as educated, as healthy, emotionally and physically as you can be, and as educated so you can deal with life. Okay. Way too much.
I am so sorry but we unfortunately have to give the kids lunch, and yes, and they need to eat. Thank you all for coming. Ravens, I did not dismiss you. Ravens, thank you. Middle school will go to lunch in a minute. High school class and Spanish, and then high school classes will go to class. Once again, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you both. And please give them one last round of applause. You may go to lunch.
But it was good. Oh, don't feel bad. Don't feel bad. I mean, it happened.